Hey, so it's Simon Rosenberg from Hopium Chronicles. It's a gathering tonight of our paid subscribers. Thanks to all of you who've made you are the engine that allows Hopium to go. You provide the fuel, I should say, for the engine that allows Hopium to go every day. And so much gratitude. And I also just want to say thank you for being along in this journey over the last year and a half. I mean, this has been, I feel, I started Hopium because I really felt in this election that I needed to be put to my highest and best use, that I knew how important the election was going to be. And I wanted to make sure that I didn't enter into election day thinking like, I didn't get everything done that I could have gotten done. And I wanted to figure out what I could do. And that was the central driving reason that I founded Hopium was to I put myself to best use. And I think at NDN, my old place, there were limits on political speech and how partisan I could be. And this was a time not to pull any punches and to go lay it all out in the playing field. And so I really feel like we've done that together. We've raised millions and millions of dollars. I'll go through that in the Q&A to do the recap, but I mean, we've made huge investments in places like North Carolina, Nebraska, Arizona, really critical places. We've raised just in the last few weeks $400,000 for John Tester and Sherrod Brown. Or $300,000, I'm sorry, for John Tester and Sherrod Brown just in a few weeks, these critical races. So just a big thank you to all of you for being part of this community and for all the amazing work that you do. And where things are 6 days out, in my view, is that I believe that we're winning this election, but we haven't won it yet. And we have to go win it together in the next 6 days. Let me go through it, and then I'm going to bring Tom in to add some color to all of this and to add his voice. Number one, that I want to begin by just acknowledging the incredible achievements of Kamala Harris to have been able to come in this very unusual situation where she didn't go through the primary process to become the nominee, that sort of that credibility that bestows on a candidate, and that kind of the sense that they beat all the other candidates and were voted on, became the nominee. She managed the transition with Joe Biden so effectively. She immediately rallied the party around her. She picked an amazing vice presidential candidate and an orthodox pick, right? But a great pick. We had the incredible convention. She kicked Trump's ass in the debate so badly that he was too scared to do another one. The big blubbery baby man couldn't actually get it together to go do another debate with the strong prosecutor Kamala Harris. She has now run this remarkable race, raised more money than anybody in history. And I think, and as we saw last night in her speech, and Tom and I were there last night, is that she's performing at an unbelievable level just as a candidate every day, every event. I mean, she is working so hard. She is busting her ass for all of us, which is one of the reasons we have to go bust our ass for her, because she's leaving it all on the playing field. And she's also run this remarkable campaign. She's allowed a campaign to be very creative. They've invented all sorts of new approaches to the media landscape that we now live in. They're producing these extraordinary events that are involving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people very directly in the campaign. There were 75,000 people at this event last night. It was unbelievable, way beyond. The campaign thought at most they'd have 50,000. That just blew it out. And so just number one, hats off to Kamala Harris. Enormous gratitude. I've known the vice president for 20 years. We go back a long way, and I'm just so proud of her. And as my friend Tara McGowan says, it's incredible to watch this formidable, capable, elegant leader step into her power in such a remarkable way in front of our eyes, and to seize this opportunity for the country. History has called her, and she's answered with everything she had, and it's why we have to answer with everything we got for her in these coming days. Next, polling. We should feel good about where we are. I think a lot of us would feel like it would be better if we were further ahead, than we are. I feel that way some days, but we're ahead. We're ahead of the national polling by 2 to 4 points. We are in a stronger position in the battleground. We just had very good polling today in Michigan and Wisconsin. We've had good polling this week in Arizona, North Carolina. Pennsylvania looks like it's really going to be a dogfight down to the end. But the national and state polling is better for us than it is for Trump, without any question. We're clearly closer to 270 than he is. And it's interesting that Trump tomorrow, I guess, is going to Virginia. in New Mexico. I mean, it's a sign of incredible desperation, as if they're going to try to put more states in play. That means they're not happy with the map that they have, right? And because those states are not going to go Republican. And I think the other reason, by the way, they're sending him is because when they send him to battleground states, it actually hurts them. So they're now sending him, they're finding a way to put him to use that in ways that will do less damage to them, right? They're kind of hiding him in the bushes for a day, right? Because we know from, that when he goes out and stumbles and is Trump, right, he actually is doing damage to himself in many of these battleground states, as he did in this event in Madison Square Garden the other night. I feel really good about the Senate. I was just on a call with Chuck Schumer, and we just had a poll showing John Tester within margin of error in Montana. I don't know if you've been following this race, but his opponent claimed that he'd been injured as a special operator overseas. It turns out that the bullet that's in his arm was something that he did himself on a hiking trip in a national park. And there's now an ad up on the air where the ranger who treated him said it was a wound that happened, a self-inflicted wound that happened. And one of his fellow servicemen who served with him said he was never shot in battle. This is going to matter in this race. I mean, this guy just lied about a war injury, bald-faced lying, very MAGA-esque. And so there's optimism that this is still a competitive race. And we know that Texas and Nebraska, that lightning could strike. Sherrod Brown, everyone has this quiet confidence that he's going to pull it out. There's no real polling showing him down. He's been ahead in all those races. So the Senate remains unbelievably competitive. In the House, there's just lots of optimism. I mean, many of you have worked. We've raised over $2 million for the 15 House races that we've endorsed, the 15 most likely to flip in the country. Many of you have met the candidates at our various events and interviews. We've done our part here in the House. And I will just tell you that people are remarkably confident and feel good about what's going to happen in the House in these swing races that we've played a major role in. I mean, we're one of the largest contributors and fundraisers to this battleground House races in the whole country. So I go in feeling good about that. The second thing that makes me feel good about where we are is that we have a greater capacity to close strong than they do. We're putting more ads on the air. We're reaching more voters through our superior ground game. And we're also what the campaign is doing now, which I think is so important that I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about, is creating this spectacle at the end of energy and passion and intensity. They are doing dozens of events in the battlegrounds every day. Bill Clinton, they released their schedule yesterday of events, and like the ninth thing they listed was Bill Clinton going to 4 different locations in Western Pennsylvania. And it was like the ninth thing on the list, right? This is the capacity of this campaign to be everywhere all at once with powerful events that are moving voters, that are engaging people and getting local media. It's been incredible. I just want to say, as somebody who's done this for a long time, I'm blown away by the way they're closing. And they needed to, because usually at the end of a presidential election, we have this big thing that happens that motivates people, lets them connect with their candidates, and that's called a debate. But because the big blubbery baby man wouldn't do the second debate, the campaign has had to fill in the gap and the intensity to drive our vote, to be talking to voters, to make the closing argument as she did last night. We've done a spectacular job at that. And what did he do? His closing argument was that hate fest in Madison Square Garden that caused enormous damage to his campaign. They don't have the ability to close strong because their candidate is a horror show and makes mistakes and is constantly getting himself in trouble. So they don't have the same capacity that we do to fill the void of this lack of a debate. And I think it's the campaign read the room right on this. They've made huge investments in building out this incredible closing, the spectacle, as I call it. And that's happened because of the money that all of us have given them. And this unprecedented money has allowed them to do something so innovative, where they're also accessing podcasts and various medias that are targeting individual people. It's been very creative. I think they've really reinvented the presidential campaign in front of our eyes in a very powerful way. And I want to give the campaign a lot of credit. And then finally, I want to say that we all know that 80 million postcards are on their way to voters. Some of them have hit, more of them are coming. One of the reasons that I remain fundamentally optimistic is that since Dobbs, we continue to overperform expectations. They continue to struggle. We keep doing better than people think, and they keep doing worse. that basic dynamic. Tom and I talked about this in 2022, and it's how we sort of got together and became the anti-red wave guys, right? Is that, but this basic dynamic, I still think is the likely scenario about what happens next week, because that dynamic came about for me for two primary reasons. One is that our superior grassroots, the motivation you all had because of the fear and opposition to MAGA, has built more. Our candidates have had more money, they've had more ability to, they've had, because of all your volunteerism, they've had more ability to reach people on the ground. And so we're building these supercharged campaigns that are allowing us to control the information environment and to push our performance again and again to the upper end of what's possible. Tom's going to talk about how we're starting to see that in the early vote in a minute. But the other reason I think that we are doing that, I'm optimistic that we're going to overperform expectations in the polls, is because we have seen repeatedly that voters are aware that I think that what happened with Dobbs is that for a chunk of the Republican Party became loosened from the Republican Party. And that group became available to us. Some of them are staying home, some of them are switching over. We saw this in 2022. And this effort that our campaign has made to create space and safety for Republicans who don't want to follow MAGA, who are non-MAGA Republicans, somewhere like 15 to 20% of their vote, to come on board with us, is, I think, a very powerful thing that they've done. Another highly successful campaign effort by the Harris-Walz campaign, because what we've seen is not even this year. The story is that Donald Trump overperforms his polling. Not this election. Republicans have been underperforming polls. Donald Trump underperformed in 19 out of 20 states. The fascists underperformed in France and in Europe this summer. Because why? It's because when people have to go vote, these people that are non-MAGA Republicans, they may say they're going to vote for Trump and Republicans in polls, but when the gravity of voting itself becomes proximate, when the act of them having to make a real decision, not an abstract one, what you've seen is that they've lost ground. It's what happened to Trump in the primaries. It's what happened in France and in Europe this summer. It's what's happened to Republicans again and again and again. And we know from research that just a few weeks ago, people who are independents, Republican-leaning folks, started volunteering in focus groups their concerns about his behavior and about how extreme he was. He was being volunteered. And why? That's exactly what we would have expected, because people were starting to really grapple with voting for him. And what they were saying is they were uncomfortable. They worried about his performance. And that's why his wild performance on the stump these last few weeks, I think, has been so damaging. Her remarkable performance, the contrast between her elegance and her grace and her power and her just the awesomeness of this campaign and the ugliness of him, is coming at exactly the right time. We're closing strong. They're closing ugly. And it's another reason. And that ugly is what people have been voting against in Europe and here all across the country. Because remember, MAGA had disappointing elections in 2018, 2020, 2022, 2023, early 2024. Fear and opposition to MAGA is the most important, is the driving force of our politics today. And Trump has done everything he possibly can to throw that ugliness in front of people over the last few weeks. And I think it's really going to matter as people make their decision in the next 6 days. It's going to help us close strong. It's going to make sure that this election that we're winning, that we actually go win it together. And so thank you, everybody. Those are my opening thoughts. I want to turn it to Tom, who's going to fill in some of the details of that, bring his own remarkable insights in this election, which he's doing crazy amounts of media. You're seeing him everywhere these days. So, Tom, welcome. And thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I'm excited to be here. I want to take a second to thank this community as well. I do a lot of these Zooms, many with very large national organizations. And I can say this is the biggest Zoom I've ever been on. It's also the most energetic. Y'all are amazing. So I love the opportunity to be here. And I appreciate the love that many of you show me when I'm here. And just also, I see it out there in Twitter and that sort of thing. People are identifying themselves with the Hopium community and chime in. So thank you all so much for everything you do. Y'all are just an incredible community. So I do want to take a few minutes to share my assessment of what we're seeing in the actual data beyond the polls, because as Simon has said, the polls are very close. they show us with a slight lead, and then it becomes a question of turnout. We have to keep in mind that when we look at these polls, they're all reflecting each pollster's individual assessment and appraisal of who they think is going to vote, what turnout is going to look like. And most of these pollsters, if not all of these pollsters, we'll exclude the red wave pollsters, but in terms of the public high quality pollsters, they're assuming turnout in a sort of very safe box. They're looking at turnout in 2020, adjusting for a population and saying, look, well, this is what would happen if turnout looked like that. And to the extent that they're accounting for any enthusiasm or you're seeing fluctuation in the polls, it's generally based on some assumptions of Republican and intensity and enthusiasm, which is not something you can effectively poll on. It's something that we have to garner from other data sources. The data that we look at, voter registration data and early vote data, because Simon touched on the other data out there, special election results, looking at the primary, that sort of thing. Those data elements are the most predictive of intensity, energy, and enthusiasm. But I will warn you, especially when it comes to early vote analysis, there's much more bad than there is good. And this year is, without question, the most difficult year to produce quality early vote analysis. Good early vote analysis relies on comparing to benchmarks, baselines, and expectations. Generally, the previous election affords us that opportunity for an analytic frame against which we can compare. We all know that 2020 isn't a great analytic frame. So we compare within that, but we have to add additional context. Same thing with voter registration to some extent. A lot of you have probably heard Republican analyses claiming that they've been winning the voter registration battle. And in reality, they've been ignoring these unaffiliated voters. We've talked about this before, even with this community, that we know that since Vice President Harris became the nominee, we've seen big increases in new voter registration among younger voters, women, voters of color, really throughout the battleground, but not just the battleground. I can tell you that those trends continue in the states that have not had their registration deadlines passed yet. We are seeing those numbers continue. We have to remember a lot of our voters register as unaffiliated for various reasons, and we don't need to go into that tonight. But a lot of these analyses aren't accounting for that, and so that's important, and we need to keep that in mind. So to the early vote quickly, because I want to make sure we have time for questions. You've probably heard Republicans talking about how they're winning the early vote. Well, there is no metric by which Republicans are winning the early vote. I want to be crystal clear about that. Republicans have talked about how their early vote is up above and beyond 2020. Well, no one's early vote is up above and beyond 2020. If you look at the battleground states at this point in the 2020 cycle, it was almost 17 million votes had been cast. Right now, we're at about 12 million, a little bit over 12 million votes have been cast. The reason for that is somewhat obvious, I imagine, and something that we've predicted going into this for months now. We're not in a pandemic anymore, at least not to the extent that we were 4 years ago when we were in the midst of it. And so we expected to see a shift away from early voting to election day voting. We know that Democrats dominated the early voting 4 years ago, both with substantial investment, but also just the fact that Democrats were more COVID cautious and therefore more likely to vote early in a means that felt safer. At the same time, we have to remember that Donald Trump told his supporters that early voting, especially mail voting, was fraudulent. So there was a mass evacuation from early voting among Republican voters following the words of their leader. And so that resulted in a very lopsided early vote. Since then, we've seen Republicans really pushing it. They admitted that that was a big strategic and tactical mistake. Speaking of mistakes, if you made the mistake of watching the Madison Square Garden rally the other night, you would have seen that every speaker at that rally, beyond saying very racist things, was also encouraging people to vote early. So you've seen this Republican push. Even Donald Trump is encouraging people to vote early. So what's happened is you've seen a slightly asymmetrical drop in early vote between the partisans. But I can tell you, when we look at modeled partisanship in the battleground states, you see a very minor difference in the partisan distribution, somewhere in the neighborhood of a point, maybe slightly more than a point differential in the partisan distribution of these voters, which to me, honestly, was quite surprising, given all of that framework, given what we know. But who are those voters who are voting early? A couple points that I'll make to underscore why I know the Republicans are very wrong when they talk about the early vote and claim momentum. Pennsylvania is a great example of this. When we look at registered Republicans who have cast a ballot already in Pennsylvania, 47% of them were election day voters 4 years ago. 46% of them were mail voters 4 years ago. Now, you can do the quick math on that, but what that tells you is that over 93% of the people who voted, the Republicans who have voted already in Pennsylvania, were people who voted in 2020, meaning they're not generating a lot of new votes. And in fact, if you look at the Democratic early voters there, only 12% of them voted on election day last time, which is, again, what we anticipated, seeing more of a shift from early voting to election day rather than the other way around. So, yes, Republicans have increased their share of the early vote. Elon Musk apparently can't stop talking about this now. He tweets about this a few times a day about the Pennsylvania early voting stats. But really what's happening is they're shifting the vote mode. That's not without import, right? There's some tactical advantages to that. But we have to remember, from a tactical advantage perspective, Democrats are still accounting for about 60% of the mail ballots cast in Pennsylvania. If you include our models of unaffiliated voters there, it's closer to 2/3 of the votes cast in Pennsylvania so far are for Democrats. So in terms of who has the tactical advantage in Pennsylvania going into election day, it is undeniably Democrats. Another quick data point that I want to share on the early vote, and then again, I'd love to get to questions. Part of the case the Trump campaign has made when they talk about why they believe they'll win and how they'll win, especially considering they lost the popular vote by, I believe, about 7 million votes 4 years ago, is they'll generate new votes from especially young men, young white men primarily, but not exclusively young white men. It's part of this bro strategy going on Joe Rogan, going on all these other podcasts. And it's a risky strategy from a tactical perspective, because we know that these young men are the lowest turnout propensity group out there. We've seen this sort of divergence in Gen Z where young women have become so much more engaged and so much more democratic and progressive, whereas young men are just detaching in general. And so if that was working, we would expect to see a Republican advantage among new registrants, because again, Republicans have been telling us that they've beat Democrats in the new registration game over the last 4 years, and they've been targeting these young men and others. Well, what I can tell you is when you look at the people who have cast a ballot already, and there are many, I think at this point, there are about 750,000 voters who have voted already just in the battleground states who weren't registered to vote in 2020. They've registered since then. And the model Democratic advantage with these voters is double what it is among all early voters, those states. So to sit with that for a moment, it's not to say that Republicans can't execute upon this strategy on election day. But if they're telling us that they won with new registrants, if they're telling us that the early vote is showing that they're winning and they have intensity and enthusiasm, it is not showing up in this data. It's not there. Simon, I think I can pause there. I could talk about the early vote forever, but
let me just add one other point.
Yeah, please do.
To add to what Tom was saying. So, we believe that the early vote was going to be more Republican than last time, right? Because they're trying this time and they didn't try last time. And so, somewhere between 5 and 10 points was sort of our guess. We didn't know. And it's been consistently now in the national vote running about 7-8 points more Republican than last time. Sort of it's become a benchmark for us to understand. In the battleground states, it's even. So we're running, 6-7 points above the national vote in the battlegrounds, which is an example of the power of our campaigns to alter the election, right? So we're making the battlegrounds much more democratic than the national vote. This is really important, right? Because if it means that we can do that and we have an advantage, then the next 6 days, we're more likely to be able to prosecute that advantage and turn that into a victory. Today, we're running ahead of 2020, and we're using that as a benchmark because the Republicans are using it. So I'm using their own benchmark against them. We're ahead of 2020 in Georgia, Michigan, Nebraska, too, and Wisconsin. We're catching up in North Carolina, Nevada, and in Arizona. Arizona, we're almost at 2020. We had this thing where there were some ballots that didn't get mailed out. So the Democratic votes kind of slowed down. We've made significant strides in Arizona. We've made significant strides in North Carolina and Nevada. And we just have to keep grinding it out. The other thing is, and I wrote about this today, is there is significant evidence now, and we can get into more of this if you want, but I want to get to questions, that some of that Republican surge vote that happened in that first weekend was Republicans voting for Kamala Harris. And we know this from polling. We know this from where the vote is coming from. It's coming from overwhelmingly Nikki Haley areas. And so, it's very possible that, to add to sort of the troubles of the Republicans, and why, anything that they're spinning very hard means it's almost certainly not true, by the way, right? It's the tell. Anything that they're trying to convince, they dumped all these red wave polls into the marketplace, not because they're winning, but because they're losing, right? It's a sign of their strength, of their weakness and desperation. They dropped more polls, red wave polls, in the marketplace in the last 3 days than any 3-day period of the entire election. That's not a sign of confidence and strength. They're trying to manipulate the understanding of the election, just like he's going to New Mexico and Virginia. Can I just tell you, I didn't know that till a few minutes ago. Guys, that's batshit fucking crazy, right? That is not the sign of a winning campaign, right? It's Hail Mary, or they're trying to hide him, right? And either way, there's no way to spin that as being a positive thing for them. They're obsessed with Virginia, but good luck with that, guys, right?
And Simon, I feel like it's also consistent with what you've been talking about and you predicted would happen, which is it's a campaign that is more focused on providing the perception that they're winning than actually doing the work to win. Whether
right.
it's the early vote analysis, the voter registration analysis, the red wave polls, and really where they're taking him. It's mostly let's add in the poly market and betting market as well.
Absurdity. Yeah, the voodoo, I call it the poly market voodoo, right? Is that they, so I just want everyone to realize, just to sort of put a bow on this, we've been doing this a long time, right? I always tell a story that when you walk into a campaign office, you can tell almost immediately whether it's a winning campaign or a losing campaign, right? Our campaign feels like a campaign that's winning. Their campaign feels like a campaign that's losing. And I just want us to live in that place where, to not give them power that they don't have, not to obey in advance, not to have anticipatory, what's the word that Timothy Snyder uses, but to not obey in advance, and to not be worried, right? We are in a competitive place. We should win this election if we work really hard. And there's going to be a million little things that come up. Don't let them get to you. Push out the noise, right? Stay focused on the work that we have to do. People who work in campaigns don't have the level of anxiety that people who are not in campaigns have, because when you're at home and like you got time on your hand, when all of us who've worked in campaigns, we're all nervous at the end, but we're just working 18 hours a day, right? And so it's okay, as Jen O'Malley Dillon said in her video today that I shared, to be anxious. What's not okay is for you not to do everything you possibly can in the next 6 days to help us win. And this old thing that Nancy Pelosi and others talk about is that you can't go into election day with regrets, right? Whether it's that extra money you're going to give, the extra, hour of calls you're going to make tomorrow, the postcard, the texting you're going to do, the canvassing you're going to do. You just got to go into election day with no regrets, everybody. It's the critical thing. Let me get to some questions. And what I'm going to try to do is get a sense of where people's heads are at. There are over 1,400 people on the call tonight. This is only paid subscribers, right? Which is amazing. Thank you all. I am going to try to do probably one more call before election day. I just haven't scheduled it yet. Yeah, let me say one thing, Tom, if I can, and maybe you can jump on this too. the significance of what happened with Puerto Rican, this sort of insult to Puerto Ricans, and then this wild explosion of Puerto Rican leaders, both in the United States and in the mainland United States and in Puerto Rico, responding to it. Because there's been response in both English and Spanish, and this is important. Yes, it's going to hurt them in places like Pennsylvania that have large Puerto Rican populations and in Florida, because it was just so extraordinary. But it's also going to hurt them with all voters who consume Spanish language media. And so it's going to matter in Arizona and Nevada too. It's going to matter in Florida and Texas too, because this is a Spanish language story. Puerto Rico is the only part of the United States that Spanish is the primary language. And so the governmental response coming from the government of Puerto Rico and leaders in Puerto Rico itself are coming out in Spanish. And what happens, and I've done a lot of work in Spanish language media, what happens is that stories where you have to translate from English and Anglo figures that nobody knows who they are, those stories don't, they put them on the news, but they don't really move people. This stuff is a week out. It's the presidential election. It's the two parties. It's the confirmation that Donald Trump is a rapist. I mean, is a racist and a xenophobe and a bigot and all the things that he is. This is going to affect a lot more than just the Puerto Rican community. It is a titanic error at the end of the election. And so, yes, this was a big mistake. Donald Trump makes a lot of mistakes. Donald Trump and his band of Star Wars bar MAGAs are extremists, and they're idiots too, right? I mean, they're not always so smart. Donald Trump not running a real field organization, there was no grand strategy behind that. That was idiotic, right? And so one of the things to remember about him is that he is a big blubbery baby man. He is an idiot. He's diminished. He is an extremist, and extremists make mistakes because they're not operating from data and strategy. They're operating from impulse. And, a lot of what happened here with this was a huge error. And what I've been really proud of is, just so happens, as many of you may know, that morning, Kamala Harris released her plan for Puerto Rico. And so she was already engaging the Puerto Rican community when this all happened. So yes, I think this is going to be something that on the margins, but this election could be won or lost on the margins, could end up becoming very significant. And it's always what I wrote today on Twitter is that I was always skeptical that the Republican to break through with Latino voters would be somebody who was an historic racist and xenophobe and the most anti-immigrant politician in modern American history. I always was skeptical, and he may have just unraveled some of the advantages he had, particularly with young Hispanic men in the last few days. Tom, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I'd like to add one little behind the scenes element of this that I think underscores what you just said. So my team today told me, and I love the way they work and the way that they're trying to find ways to leverage data and technology to help Democrats win. And they said, look, going through our data, we're able to identify over 3 million Puerto Rican registered voters in the continental US, including over 300,000 in Pennsylvania and over 600,000 in Florida. Through the techniques they have, finding the area code on the cell phone the person has and various other elements. And so I just tweeted it out. I said, look, we got to get this out. We're blasting it out to the folks and partners and affiliate organizations in our space to let them know we had it. Within an hour, I have responses from over a dozen national orgs and then a handful of folks within Pennsylvania and Florida who say, let's go, let's get this data, we're on it. So, we know we've already been communicating, and now to have this very targeted database to be able to target these, there will be surround sound messaging to these voters and these communities throughout next week.
Tom, that's a great story.
Very excited about it.
Yeah, me too. I didn't know. I mean, thank you for that. There was another. Some this has come up in a few questions, and it's about something that Tom and it's in my writing and something Tom talks about a lot. But Tom, can you talk about why in your data, the target early data, why the Republican, it's broken up into D, R, and I mean, or unaffiliated, mm-hmm. D, R, and unaffiliated. Can you talk about why it's likely that both the R and the unaffiliated categories are going to be slightly more Democratic this time than 2020?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, because it's important. So let me give you a thing to work with. In the last update, we were we were 0.5%, half of 1% behind the Republicans compared to 2020, essentially even, right? But what that means is, what does that mean?
Well, what that means is, uh, first, let's take the independent unaffiliated. As I alluded to a few moments ago, we know that there has been a movement in voter registration, but also in self identification, especially among Gen Z, where they're less likely to identify with either party or register with either party. And in some cases, that's just a choice. In some cases, it's like a automatic voter registration state, of which there are many, most of the battleground states now. Nevada is the best example of this, where if you look at who is registered to vote in the past year, it is almost a majority now are registering as unaffiliated. When you look at who they are, they're overwhelmingly younger than new registrants have been in the past, and they are more likely to be voters of color. And when we look at the polling of these groups, we know, think about the Harvard IOP survey, but also other quality surveys that have larger sample sizes of these voters. We know that they are still providing Democrats and Vice President Harris with overwhelming margins. Well, from a partisan model perspective, the partisan model is not picking that up. The partisan model is not trying to predict candidate support. It is a proxy for partisan registration where you don't have partisan registration. So it really suffers from some of the same flaws of partisan registration. And so our expectation is that Vice President Harris and Democrats up and down the ballot will win a large majority of those unaffiliated voters. And so, number one, very good sign there. Number two, when we talk about Republicans, it's important to keep in mind that the early vote data and these models, these partisan models, are not attempting to predict crossover vote. Again, it's just a generic partisan identification. We know in 2020, because the data is reported, most states, when they report the election results, they will break out the vote totals by vote mode. And so we know that if you were a Republican who voted before Election Day in 2020, you were significantly more likely to vote for Democratic candidates, including President Biden, than those who voted on Election Day. Simon alluded to this a minute ago, talking about the Nikki Haley vote. I actually looked at this just a little bit before this call and found that just over a third of the registered Republicans who have voted already in Pennsylvania voted in the Republican presidential primary before Election Day. So you've got a big chunk. And what we know is Nikki Haley did much better with the early voters in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So, and then the last point here, and Simon alluded to this as well, but if you look at the national polls and state polls, New York Times, Siena had this, a handful of polls have broken out a crosstab on those who have voted already, and you're seeing really astonishing margins among those voters. And I want to temper my enthusiasm a little bit. That is actually the easiest possible group to sample. It shouldn't suffer from the same flaws as a likely voter model, which is guessing at who's going to vote. In this case, they know who is going to vote. But what we're seeing is these massive margins, which even if the pollsters universally oversampled Democrats, which is statistically almost impossible, but again, I'm being cautious, it would still suggest that we are seeing substantial crossover voting among unaffiliateds and Republicans who have voted early, crossing over to vote for Vice President Harris.
Yeah, there's been some independent work done showing that the counties and the legislative districts that are voting most heavily Republican so far are the same places where Haley did well, which is a problem for them, right? I mean, and the campaign, our campaign, would not have spent as much time with Liz Cheney and Olivia Troy and all the work they were doing with Republicans if they were not convinced it was working, right? Because they've made a major investment in elevating up Republicans and reaching out across the aisle, creating space for Republicans who weren't comfortable with MAGA to join our pro-democracy coalition. The only reason they would have done that as much as they have is if it was working, right? And so it's really important to understand, that there is now evidence that we're seeing, and it's not definitive, right? Because we're now getting in a place where you can't really know, but that there is that some of that surge Republicans had was actually Republicans voting for Harris and not voting for Trump, right, is certainly something we think. Let me go. Let me keep looking at some questions. I want to make one comment about, because it's come up, Tom, if I can do this, about the red wave polls. So there have been now 32 organizations. I've now moved Atlas Intelligence into being part of the red wave. They've released either close to, or even now potentially today, I haven't totaled it, over 100 polls. It started much earlier this time. It's been far more comprehensive. The two states they've really focused on have been Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Pennsylvania has gotten a disproportionate number. In October, a majority of the polls released in Pennsylvania have been red wave polls. And also, and the question is, and now 2 weeks ago, they really started attacking the national polling averages. They pushed the national polling average down in 538 from 2.6 to 1.8. That tipped all the forecasters over. So many people who read Nate Silver or 538's forecast or The Economist, they'd all sort of tipped all together. Steve Kornacki, that same weekend started saying the averages have moved. And as you see in my writing, I try to disaggregate the national average from the red wave averages and from 538. So you can see the difference. It's the red wave polls are running about 3 to 4 points more Republican than the independent polls, which is very similar to what Tom and I saw in 2022. But I just want to explain why I think this is happening, right? Because I think this is important. And yes, it's incredibly disappointing that the national media hasn't, sort of admitted publicly this is all happening again, particularly given that it already happened once, and we all know that. Number one is that Trump needs to believe that he's beating her, that he can't really, there isn't Trumpism if he's losing to a woman. And so in the core of his strongman identity and his misogyny is that it's inconceivable that he could ever be losing or being behind in the polls. Second is that I think it's a critical tactic for them to obscure his ugliness. Because what he says, essentially what he's saying to all of us, I may be a rapist, a fraudster, a traitor, and a felon, but I'm leading in the polls and I'm strong, and she's losing in the polls and she's weak. I may be trying to end American democracy for all time, blow up the global economy, and end the Western alliance that's kept us safe, but I'm leading in the polls and I'm strong, and she's losing in the polls and she's weak. I may be a misogynist and a bigot and a racist and a xenophobe, but I'm leading in the polls. And so it's been a tactic to obscure his ugliness. And because if he's losing, then the ugliness becomes more pronounced. The emperor has no clothes, right? But the third thing, and it's come up tonight, is they're preparing the ground for the contesting the election next week, right? There can't be any doubt about that this is a central goal of this project. It's very likely that 80% of their voters now believe that Donald Trump is winning in a landslide. And so when he ends up not winning next week, and he's showing all sorts of vibes that they are not winning, including the fact that they continue to dump all these polls, and he's going to crazy places like Virginia and New Mexico, is that they're sending all these vibes that they're losing. But to their audience, just in the way, do you know that 85% of Republicans believe that Joe Biden stole money from the people in North Carolina and FEMA and gave it to undocumented immigrants? It was literally something invented. And they've invented his strength and his victory in order to contest the election. We're not going to get into tonight about what happens next week when that begins. We're going to talk about winning the election tonight. But there should be no mistake about how this effort to soften the ground on he's winning when he's not winning is the first stage of the process of them to contest the election next week, which they're going to do. And they're going to do it for the same reason they've run the red wave play. The red wave play worked in 2022, so they've run it again. The stealing the election thing almost worked in 2020, 2021. So they're going to try it again. And what we can do by winning this election by as big a margin as we possibly can, and by Tom and I continuing to contest and sort of expose this red wave fiasco and that's going on, is that we have to make it harder for them to do it, right? That's the bigger the margin, the more we run up the score, the more we win the election, it gets harder. So if you're worried about him contesting the election, then you should make 20 hours of phone calls in the next few days, right? Because that's the most important way you can deal and mitigate what will come, next week. Okay, let me get to a few more questions, everybody. Sorry. And it's so fun to say my thing. He's a rapist, fraudster, traitor, and a felon. Michelle Obama went there the other night really well, by the way. I thought that was great. Pennsylvania, Tom. Let's talk about that for a minute, because you have a theory about what we're seeing in the early vote in Pennsylvania, and yeah, Pennsylvania is a dogfight, right? I mean, we had really good polls in Michigan, Wisconsin today. I've talked to Ruben Gallego. He's very confident that Kamala Harris is going to win there, and he's going to win. North Carolina, the early vote's gotten much better. They still have the millstone of Mark Robinson around all of their necks there. We know Anderson Clayton has put the best team on the field ever. Georgia early vote has gotten so much better this last week. It's really encouraging. But let's talk about Pennsylvania. Tom, give us your thoughts about the early vote in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I mean we're seeing largely what we expected to see. We have to keep in mind that Pennsylvania is generally just a vote by mail state. They have a sort of hybrid early in person. You can go in and apply for your mail ballot in person and then file it right there. But it's not like the early in person in other states. And so you are seeing Republicans increase their vote share among the early vote. But like I alluded to a little while ago, it's overwhelmingly people who voted on election day. In fact, that is a plurality of Republican voters. By the time we get through and all the mail ballots are in, based on the trend we've been seeing, I would actually expect to see a majority of Republican early votes have been cast by people who voted on election day. As I said before, it's at 47% now. And the remaining 46% are those who actually voted by mail last time around. So when you actually zero in on Pennsylvania and look at what we call the low propensity voters, those who maybe voted in 2020 and haven't voted since, you look at the new registrants, you look at people who didn't vote in 2020 at all, you're still seeing a Democratic advantage among those voters. So again, I feel good about those numbers in the context that they're not showing any sort of extraordinary Republican enthusiasm. But Pennsylvania looks very close. So, again, to the extent that anyone was expecting that there might be some sort of big red wave surprise and many more Republicans coming out in Pennsylvania, or they're reading the early vote that way, that's a mistake.
Yeah, and it means for those of you in New York, a lot of New Yorkers, my old home, will go to Philadelphia and go to Eastern Pennsylvania to volunteer. Do it this weekend. I mean, it's important. I mean, Pennsylvania really is going to be an incredible battleground for those in the DMV. People here go up to Pennsylvania. I hope some of you go down to North Carolina too, right? Don't we need to go down there? I mean, there's less of a tradition of people going down to North Carolina. It's easy to get down there this weekend. And you saw today that the president, I mean, Kamala Harris and Governor Walz were in North Carolina today. They hit 3 media markets between them, just so we all understand that North Carolina is still a major priority. We just had 2 independent polls showing the race dead even, which is where I think the race is. And I will tell you, dead even race, I'd rather be us than them, because they've still got to deal with the the Mark Robinson thing is a brand problem for them. And you just don't want to go into election day on the same ticket as Mark Robinson, right? It's not good. We all know what this means, Tom. And in the same way, you don't want to be on the same ticket with Carrie Lake and her crazy negatives in Arizona. Let me go to there's a lot of questions here. I want to let everybody know that Target Early, which I link to every day, you can go in and look at the early vote performance in every congressional district. You can go into state legislative districts. Some of you are asking about individual areas. Just go check yourself. I mean, it's a very easy, I think it's a very easy tool to use. It may take a few minutes for you to kind of wander around, through it. I want to say the Biden comments have no bearing whatsoever in this election, and we all need to stop talking about it. Kamala Harris is the candidate. It's a distraction. Don't go down the rabbit hole, right? Everyone here, this is something we talk about at Hopium all the time, is don't take the bait. Don't let them define your reality. This is a non-event in the election. She's had an amazing few days. They're going to use it to distract and don't, we're all too smart. If you're a Hopium person, you've been through this too much over the last year and a half, is that we don't let their craziness and their extremism and the right-wing noise machine define our realities, right? We need to stay on offense here. We need to close strong and confident. We're kicking we're winning this election. We haven't won it yet. and let's go kick his ass and stop. We need, as a family, to stop taking the bait so much from them when they put it out there. It's really critical, particularly in these last 6 days. And let me see, Tom, if I can get a few other things. Any just thoughts? Did you cover young voters? I mean, was there anything that you want to say about what you're seeing with young voters? That
No, I mean, to the extent that we know that early vote is dropping substantially from 2020. Again, in 2020, the early vote was about 2/3 of all votes cast. It'll be somewhere around a half or a little bit more than half of all votes cast. So if you look at the composition of who is making that shift happen, it's overwhelmingly going to be younger voters. So we're not going to have a lot of signs of intensity or enthusiasm from young voters in the early vote data. That's where we sort of rely on the voter registration data. And we know, as I've talked about before, that you're seeing great numbers since Vice President Harris became the nominee for registration among young voters in these battleground states. So that's key to remember. And then the other point that I want to make is, to the extent that we believe that the polls aren't factoring in this post Dobbs environment or this Dobbs surge, which I don't believe they are, we won't see that in the early vote. But for the most part, we actually are seeing increases in turnout among Democratic seniors, especially Democratic senior women, which I believe is very much connected to Dobbs. But to the extent that there's the other end of that spectrum where we know that Dobbs mobilizes younger women overwhelmingly, we expect to see that happen on election day. So the fact that we're not seeing that in the early, and it's not that we're not seeing it at all in the early vote. Actually, if you look at younger voters, the gender gap is bigger than it was at this point in 2020. So that's not like, no, that's a pretty big thing still that's happening given the Republican shift. But I think there's the potential to see something much bigger on election day.
Any final thoughts? Anything that you didn't get to cover?
I don't think so. Again, I'll stress my gratitude for being here, getting the chance to talk with y'all, and for the amazing work y'all have done. I see it out there in the community among Democratic organizations and activists writ large, and how in awe I think we all are of this community and what you all have built. So thank you for that, and looking forward to joining you again, maybe on the other side of this to talk about the great work that we all did.
Tom, I may drag you back before election day, but we'll see.
I'm here. I don't move very far from these, square tent meetings.
I know. When I went to the event yesterday, I was like off Twitter for like 4 or 5 hours, and I was getting the shake. I was getting the shakes. Let me close out, and Tug, my dog, may be joining us here. Hold on, let me close the door. And let me just, Tom, and I don't know if you could stick around for a second. I want you to hear this. So I want to just close with something I talk about here a lot as a way of closing out many of these meetings, but I think it's particularly important right now, which is, why are we all here? What are we doing here? Right? All of you could be doing something else tonight, and you're here, and because you love your country and you're willing to fight for it. And I'm really so grateful to be in this community with all of you. But I think a central reason that I'm here, and I think really all of us are here, is based on something that Joe Biden talked about in his State of the Union address in January or in March of this year, which is the idea. He referenced FDR's State of the Union address in 1941. And what he said about that speech was that it was really the beginning of the rallying of the American people to go fight the fascists, a rallying that ended up being successful. And in that speech, Joe Biden, that speech, which he alluded to as the State of the Union speech, is also known as the Four Freedoms speech. And it's the speech where FDR articulated these founding principles of the modern world, which is a world based on freedom and not dominion. And the four freedoms of freedom of speech and religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. I love the concept of freedom from want, right? It's such a powerful thing. These simple formulations that FDR himself wrote on a yellow pad, they still have the yellow pad where he wrote this out in preparation for the speech, became those words, and that theory became the foundation of the modern world that we live in today. They were the foundation of the Atlantic Charter signed in 1941 that became the basis of the alliance that won World War II. They became in the foundation of the United Nations Charter, which is was set up, the United Nations was set up to create a world of freedom and not dominion, where nations didn't have control over one another. They became the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, which was negotiated in part by Eleanor Roosevelt, which then created an international law and understanding that human beings had rights, not just nations, which had been the case up until this point, and that they to extend this notion of a world of freedom and not dominion to people themselves and not just to nations. And that foundation of the world that FDR built and articulated in those four freedoms, and the work that our country did to sort of build a world around them, NATO and Pax Americana, the United Nations, and all these tools of the modern world, that world over the last 80 years has created a golden age in human history. There's never been a better time to be alive in all of human history than during these last 80 years. We've seen global poverty rates plummet to very low levels despite a huge explosion of population. Life expectancy has gone from 45 years to 71 years. We've seen more people living under democracies today, or in recent years anyway, than any time in human history. And literacy has tripled during this period, meaning that far more people can do and contribute and pursue their dreams than any other time in human history. There's never been a better time to be alive in all of human history than in these last 80 years, this time of the four freedoms. And what's important to us as we go ready to go win this election is that we did that. The Democratic Party of the United States created a golden age in human history. That it is very arguable, and I will make this argument, that no other organized political force has done more good for more people than the Democratic Party of the United States. And that we've allowed billions of people to pursue their dreams in ways that was unimaginable in a world prior to World War II and to FDR's four freedoms. And what we have to understand about what this election is all about is that Donald Trump and Greater MAGA and Vladimir Putin and the Chinese leaders and the Iranian leaders want to return to a world not of freedom, but of dominion, where people have control over one another. And that's what's at stake here, right? Is that world that we built, and we imagined and built, and that many Americans died for, is under extraordinary threat domestically and abroad. And what is important to me as I get ready to go finish this with all of you is that our party was called once before in the 1940s, and we answered this call. And we're all being called again. And one of the reasons I'm so confident we're going to win is because all of you are answering the call. Millions of you have gone to work, 80 million postcards, unprecedented number of door knocks, incredible numbers of phone calls, unprecedented levels of donations, right, that have fueled our campaigns. All of you have been answering this call powerfully, inspirationally, right? Every day you've gone and done the work. It's why we've been winning in all these elections all across the country. Yeah, we've had good candidates, we've had good issues, but we're winning because of all of you and because all of you are answering this call. But as important as all the work that we've done to this point has been, the work we do in these next 6 days is more important. And it's why we've got to go leave it all out in the playing field, because now what we're battling for is the future, not just of our kids and our grandkids, but the kids and the grandkids of all the people of the entire world. Because we need to make sure that this world of freedom and not dominion that was given to us is there for our kids and our grandkids, but all the kids and grandkids of all the people throughout the entire world. That's what's at stake here. And so let's go to work, everybody. Let's be inspired by our leaders who've come before and make sure that we are as resolute and strong as they were in defending their country as we're about to be over these next 6 days. Tom, thank you so much for being here. Love you guys so much. You know, it's when we fight, we win. And hard work is good work. We can do hard things, all those things. Let's go to work and win this thing together. Thanks, everybody, so much.